Him. He must have been trying to decide if there was someone there or not.
The man was wearing a wetsuit. She assumed he was a diver, hoisting air tanks onto the side of the boat.
And then I realised that he toppled them over the side of the boat and thought, well, he can't be putting them on his back. When he's toppled them into the water, which seems a bit strange, oh, he must be dumping an old carpet or some heavy rubbish. So I said to John, what do you think he's doing there? That's when I jokingly said, I hope that's not his wife in there.
Well, yeah, of course, it did cross our mind, had Mr. and Mrs. Young seen Gordon Park, you know, would he be stupid enough to dispose of Carol during the day? But for me, knowing Gordon Park's character and the way he didn't like to take risks, the best time for him not to be disturbed or not to be identified as doing something covert would be by going on that lake during the day, the way he'd done many times before on Coniston and Windermere. So it doesn't surprise me, you know, and it isn't out of character with him.
So in fact, the Young's evidence was a little bit of icing on the cake for us. We had a case going to trial, and lo and behold, we managed to get some more evidence.
It had taken 28 years to bring him to justice, but finally, in November 2004, Park came before a judge and jury.
Initially, he didn't seem fazed by the trial at all. Almost the fact that he was actually enjoying the publicity of it all. That's the impression I got. And I think he thought, well, yeah, I'm on trial here, but I'm going to be found not guilty.
Even when standing trial for murder, Park still maintained his self-control.
Gordon Park was in the witness box for quite a long time, and there were breaks every so often. Now, he maintained control for most of the time that he was in the witness box, but when the jury went out, he more or less turned around and faced the wall to compose himself and stayed that way until just before the jury came back in, which I've never seen before, certainly.
But as the weeks passed, Park's composure began to slip when he was caught out telling several significant lies.
But there were 2 or 3 occasions on which we were able to confront him with direct evidence, which he hadn't appreciated was in the unused material from the case, although he had access to it, just hadn't thought his way through it.
Park tried to discredit the Young's evidence that they'd seen him dumping the body within days of Carol's murder.
In his own defence, Gordon Park said, well, Mrs. Young can't have seen me for various reasons, didn't have a boat like that, wasn't there anyways, and, by the way, I didn't wear spectacles in 1976. It was only much later that I started wearing spectacles. We knew then, the moment that was raised, we became quite excited because we knew we'd be able to rebut that. Well, unknown to Gordon Park, during the 1997 investigation, hundreds of photographs had been seized by the police, and lo and behold, we found a photograph taken in 1973 of Gordon with Carol, therefore must have been taken before Carol's death, wearing spectacles.
He then claimed he wasn't sailing on Coniston when Carol was murdered, and that he'd sold his boat a month earlier. But again, police were one step ahead of him. They had his sailing logbook. Actually, in the log, rather than just saying which boat he was using for which particular hours on the lake, it actually said when he bought each boat and when he sold each boat. The entry read, sold July 1976, which was clearly the month that Carol Park was murdered and a body was deposited in the lake. So, of course, when this document was passed around the jury, which was in Gordon Park's own handwriting, and it was pointed out to him that yet again he'd lied to the jury, he said, well, I'm sorry, but I've just made a mistake. Finally, after 5 weeks, it was down to the jury to decide Park's fate.
The atmosphere in court was so tense. I don't think I'll ever be in court with a tense atmosphere like that. It was electric.
It took the jury just 10 hours to come back with a verdict. Guilty.
I looked across at Gordon Park, and he basically just stared and then just put his head down.
Tremendous shock. They say I collapsed, I did. Don't know much about that, it was only seconds. Then I felt a numbness. And then I just felt, well, it's justice for Carol, and that's what this has been about.
There was no euphoria from my team. We weren't punching the air and shouting and cheering because there was too many victims in this case, you know. Carol Park, the main victim in it all. Carol Park's family, victims then and victims now and victims forever.
Park had killed his wife when he was 32. At the age of 61, and 2 wives later, he was finally sentenced to life imprisonment.
I mean, that poor lass, all these years, people thought she'd gone off with somebody, and all these years she's been lying there, and he's got away with it.
Carol can never be brought back. She died an horrific death. This was no lover's tiff. But the real thing that gets me is the dishonesty and the deceit.
And if he'd admitted what he'd done 30 years ago, he'd have served a shorter sentence, he'd have been out, and it would have all been over and done with much sooner than this. So I'm sorry, if he's going to spend 20 years at the end of his life, then it's only what he deserves.